So our Torah reading is the second Torah reading in Bamidbar. The Torah reading is called Nasso. Nasso, which means pick up, raise, literally speaking. It's found on page 791 in our Eitz Chaim Chumash, and it is Numbers chapter 4, verse 21 is where it starts. And the Eternal speaks to Moses saying, Nasso, at Rosh B'nai Gershon, Gamheim. And as I said, the word Nasso means literally to raise up. Hold on one second, please. There. Colloquially, or whatever it is, whatever the word is, it means to count. So here our translation is take a census of the Gershonites also. We're on, as I said, verse 21. This is a continuation from last week's process where there was a census of the military-aged male Israelites who needed to be ready to go out to war. And the Levites were excluded from that count. Even if you were an able-bodied Levite, you weren't going to go into the army. Rather, you were reserved for the work of the Levites centering around taking care of the sanctuary. And there are three basic clans of Levites, following from, three patriarchs of those clans. So there's Gershon, Kehat, and Merari. Kehat was the patriarch of the clan that Moses and Aaron belonged to. They were discussed last week. And Merari was also last week. And now, this is the beginning of this week, it says, and also now let's make sure that you also count up the people in the Gershonite clan, and they're given their marching orders as well. Each of these three clans was divided up to take care of different aspects of carrying the pieces of the sanctuary when it was dismantled, when they had to do their journeying through the wilderness to get to the land of Israel. And that's what we're doing now. Last week we talked about it, and now this week more preparations for all of that. So that's the beginning of our Torah reading with a lot of numbers and stuff like that, and instructions about their jobs, what they carry. And then chapter 5, we have a provision that, okay, now we've gotten a clearly defined encampment. It started from last week and now we finished doing it this week. Once we have a clearly defined encampment, then the rules of preserving the holiness of the encampment kick in, and certain impure people need to be taken out of the encampment. So there are the tsarua, there's, what is it? Did I miss anybody else? Yeah. Tsarua and zav and tamei lanefesh. Three categories of serious impurity. First one is the tsarua, the person who contracts the skin disease that we talked about before. That person has to be sent out of the entire encampment. The zav, the person who suffers from some kind of unusual genital emission, could be it's some kind of possibly sexually transmitted disease thing, syphilis, that's the word I'm looking for. So that could be it, or gonorrhea, that's the one that they usually say, right? Michael is nodding his head. Good. So, then the last one is if you have encountered a corpse, if you've been in the same space with a dead body, that person is kicked out. So the zav the one who has the emissions is kicked out of the sanctuary area, but not the entire encampment. And then the one who is tamei, ritually impure because of encountering death, can't come into the interior parts of the shrine. So this is the flip side of defining a community. Every defined community has borders, and these borders are here temporarily enforced, right? These are people who are members of the community in terms of the sociological realities, but in terms of the space that the community takes up, there are holy spaces that are out of bounds for people who are in that status. I want to, except for the tsarua, which of course the Torah doesn't say it explicitly, we say it. In the other two cases, there's no indication that this person has sinned in any way, right? On the contrary, if I'm part of the Chevra Kadisha and I'm taking care of a person who died and making sure that they get buried properly, I'm doing a big mitzvah. So the fact that I contract ritual impurity as a result is no reflection on, whether I'm, a pious person or a good person or anything like that. The ritual impurity is a fact that has nothing to do with any value judgment. So this is simply the reality of the way that the Torah defines holiness. The shrine area, and then in concentric circles beyond the shrine area, have a requirement to be kept, quote unquote, ritually pure. So it's a very short section, and that's followed then by another detail of sacrificial details having to do with returning stolen property or lost property and things like that. And if you didn't do it, and now you want to make up for it, you can do that. That's a tiny little section. Then we have the notorious sota section. The sota is the woman who is suspected of unfaithfulness to her husband, and the husband can't prove it, but he's so overcome with jealousy, he brings her to the shrine, and she has to undergo this, it's not quite a trial by ordeal, but something's very, very reminiscent of a trial by ordeal. And if she passes, that shows that the suspicions of the husband were unfounded. And she's, obviously exonerated, and she is blessed, perhaps. Hold on, now my thing is. I'm sorry, I got unplugged. She's blessed with a child, perhaps. And if she is guilty of his suspicions, then the waters that she drinks will make her belly, pretty much explode or something. So it's it's a trial by divine fiat. When evidence is missing, but where there are strong emotions at play. So we've talked about that over the years. And then chapter 6 is the Nazarite text. I talked about that a little bit in the Torah Sparks. A very peculiar kind of situation where a person makes a very specific kind of vow, and that vow bestows upon this person, and it can be explicitly here, the Torah, as it does not often do, says this is for a man or a woman. This is anybody. the vow bestows a status on this person, and they are called a Nazir. A Nazir means somebody sort of set aside, off to the separated out and off to the to the back. The word nazoru is they turned their backs to something. They retreated. Somebody who retreats from society. So there are all the details of that situation, and that goes on for a bunch. Then finally, and chapter 6, verse 22, we introduce the threefold blessing that the priests are supposed to chant or speak out to the children of Israel, to call down upon the children of Israel God's blessings. So that's the famous Yevarechecha, the threefold priestly blessing that has become such a precious part of our tradition. Then chapter 7 is the end, the culmination of the dedication of the Mishkan, and we have the chieftains, the princes, the heads of each tribe are moved to make a number of donations. First, they make a spontaneous donation to help the Levites, which is very nice. They donate 6 wagons. The Levites, remember at the beginning, I said they have to carry around they're the schleppers. They schlep all of the pieces of the Mishkan. So the Nesiim, the chieftains, come up with this great idea, very nice, to give them wagons so that they don't have to schlep it all by hand. They can load up the wagons, and they give them also animals that can, oxen that can carry that can pull the wagons. So the Levites just have to drive the wagons. They don't have to actually schlep the stuff. And this is good for 2 of the 3 clans, but not for the Kahatites, not for the people of Kahat. Their carrying has to be by katefi, so they have to carry it on their shoulders, and what they carry is the most holy of all the implements, the ark and so on. And then finally, the last part of the Torah reading is pages of almost an identical text, because we have 12 chieftains, each one giving a set of gifts, sacrificial gifts to the sanctuary to, sort of initiate the altar. And each day, one tribe comes and they give their gift. And then on the second day, another tribe is represented by their chieftain, and they give the same gift. And then as the first tribe, and then the third day, the next tribe. And this goes on for 12 tribes, and the Torah doesn't skip a word. It constantly just keeps on telling us again and again and again, except for changing the name at the beginning and the day. The first day is this prince, and the second day is this prince. But after that, it's 99.9% identical words and trup. So actually, even though this is a nice long Torah reading, Torah readers who have to read this section get off easy, because once you basically learn one day, then you know all the other days. So, and that's the conclusion of our Torah reading, is with this just pageantry of day after day after day after day of these gifts. Because once these gifts are over, spoiler alert, next week, the Torah reading, we actually set off. We actually get moving and leave Mount Sinai. So that's the whole summary of our Torah reading. What do people want to focus on? Anybody have a suggestion? Anybody have a burning issue that they want to focus on? All right, so we'll just read the Parsha silently for the next, 38 minutes and enjoy ourselves. Okay, good. So that's it. So, okay, what are we going to do? We're not going to read all the numbers of who's in the Gershon clan, right? So let's do it by process of elimination. Okay, we're not going to do that. Do we want to read about, it's altogether like 3 verses. We want to read about kicking people out of the camp. We sort of talked about that last week also, right? So, okay, so we're skipping that. Then we have a little piece that's not that much paid attention to, but when you betray your fellow and you say, I don't know any information about somebody, but you do, or I don't know where their lost article is, but you do, then when you finally fess up, you have to make amends. So that's this little section, that's chapter 5, verses 5 through 10, with a little interesting addendum. You know what? Why don't we do that? Since we never do it, right? So there's always an exception. We never do it except for today. So, all right, this is 794 in the Eitz Chaim. It's Numbers chapter 5, verse 5. Somebody want to please do us the honor of reading it out loud?
I have the Alter version with me. If
you have the what?
I have the Alter version with me. I don't know if the Robert Alter.
Right, good. So that'll keep us all on our toes. Okay. So out loud, we're going to have the Robert Alter version, and let's see how that lines up with what we have in our different editions, the Eitz Chaim or whatever else. Okay, the Eitz Chaim is the JPS edition, right? The Eitz Chaim translation is the Jewish Publication Society edition. And then sometimes there are other versions. Okay, so Robert Alter's translation. Go.
And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the Israelites.
What, already there's a difference. Did anybody notice a difference? Read it nice and slow. One more time, please.
And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the...
What? That, no,
and.
No. That's it.
And.
And
there is
Alter
there in the Hebrew.
The word and. JPS regularly takes out the word and.
Yeah, Alter likes all the conjunctions that are left in, and you get them all.
If you go back a couple of pages, right? Look at the very beginning of Nasso, right? Chapter 4, verse 21. What does Alter have?
And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying.
All right. And he said, and he even has saying, which JPS decided they must have like used up their word count that day, and they took out the saying. So a little tiny little thing. One letter that's in the Torah reading, in the original text, which JPS figures is really irrelevant and unimportant, but which Alter decides, what the heck, I'm going to put it in. So, should we take this opportunity? Why the heck? Why not? What's that all about?
Well, I know from Alter's opinion, like he has, from what I've read of his commentary, he's very keen on all these interjections and conjunctions and just keeping the rhythm of what's actually in the Hebrew as much as possible. I know he takes liberties elsewhere, but he does try to keep to the, just the way the language is. He has a lot of trust in it as literature, so he doesn't want to mess it up too badly. And he sees it as a whole thing. So if there's an and there's a reason for it. So if there's a repetition, like spoken, saying, and etc., he'll always keep those in.
So Alter was, he's already getting on in years, but for a whole generation, he was one of the major literary students of the Bible. Right? He wasn't, so interested in the archaeology. He wasn't, he was always up on all those things. You have to be educated. But his main thing wasn't dividing up the text into this source and that source or things like that. His, contribution was, let's appreciate the artfulness of the text that we have. That there's a tremendous amount of creativity and thought that was put into creating the text as it is before us. And he's written studies and books and analyses and so on. And his, culminating work is the fact that he did this translation with his notes. So you could have argued the opposite way. The JPS editors were fully convinced that the conventions of English literature do not require that you begin every sentence with "and." It's like where young people say "like" all the time, or all the time, something like that. So they were fully convinced that literarily nothing is lost by cutting out the "ands."
I mean, to be blasphemous, but don't you think, like, if that was their goal, to have put it in lovely English, why didn't they put their translation in lovely English? Why is it like such an awkward translation? It's not, it's not like, that's just my opinion, but it's not a beautiful translation, so you may as well have stuck with the text.
I don't think it's a beautiful translation either. I've on record again and again and again, being pretty unhappy with the translation. But I think their goal was to be absolutely readable and, in keeping with contemporary usage. So, they didn't want to put in the thous. Walter doesn't either, obviously. But also they wanted to make it just sort of like, just read it so that you don't have to read it 15 times, in order to get the syntax of the sentence and stuff like that. So they changed syntax. If the Hebrew puts this clause in front of that clause, they don't care about changing it around because they just want it to be readable. The word saying, here they actually have a saying, but at the beginning of the Parsha, they don't have the word saying. That's a translation of lay more, right? And the translation that we have all over the place is saying. Isn't it redundant? The Lord spoke to Moses. So, colon. And then here's what he says, right? So what is saying? So a lot of people just say, yeah, saying is because they didn't have quotation marks back in those days. So it's like an indication of okay, get ready for a quote. That's the way many people read it. So good, now we have quotation marks. So we don't need the word saying. Right, that's but they don't have quotation marks either. Other people think that the word saying has a different meaning. Saying, lay more, literally is to say. To say. And they read lay more as God spoke to Moses, instructing him to say the following. So it's not direct quote of God, but rather it's part of God's instruction. Moses, you got to pass this on. You've got to continue to repeat these words to others. So they see lay more as actually a command by God to Moses, say these words. I'm going to say them to you, now you say them, which is a little bit of a different kind of meaning. And why should we take it out if it's there?
He has both, because it's the Lord spoke, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to." So it's
that's the speak. You can't help it. That's in the next verse. It says it. Even JPS.
Okay.
That has it there too. The and is a little less, obvious as a compelling choice, but Alter's sense is it's part of the style, and it's there, so keep it. And one of these days, maybe we'll have a good insight as to why it's there. Maybe somebody will actually then be able to feel the kind of flow that the word and assumes.
I don't know about that, because and is such an overused term in discourse. And of this short section, what is it? This was 5 or 6 lines. What is it? 5, 6, 7, 8, 6 lines. 5 of the 6 lines start with and.
You know what?
And I mean, when a lot of people do that, you hear people when they're talking, and what you do is you tune it out. So I think that there's other things that you've spoken about, that the translation isn't so good. I don't know if anything gets lost by not having all the ands. I don't know.
Sarita, do you think that that's because we speak English, which is a language which requires a thesaurus? You don't notice, like, English is a weird language in that we don't have to repeat words, but almost every other language does, especially a language like Hebrew, which is tiny. I'm sorry, but it's like the amount of vocabulary it has is tiny compared to, I had to, like, tutor.
No,
I had to tutor a kid for the SATs because she crashed and burned coming from Hebrew to English. Like, there's no Hebrew, like, there's so few Hebrew words compared to what you have to learn for English SATs. It's like crazy. So if you're speaking any language, even Spanish, which, you just repeat so much more than you do in English. I think that's a thing of our English ears because we have such a broad vocabulary. So that's why it doesn't bother me to repeat, especially if you're trying to capture something about the source language.
But that still doesn't explain why and. I mean, and almost becomes, a meaningless kind of just sort of, getting yourself started.
So when we get into the rest of these verses, I know it's my fault that we haven't, but when we get into the rest of these verses, let's check and see whether there is any functionality to those ands. But the point of this introductory verse and is different. Here, the and could be, arguably completely irrelevant and unnecessary. It starts off a new section in the Masorah. The previous paragraph ends. In the Torah, there's a blank space that separates that previous verse from this next verse. Is the and really necessary? But I think that the ands that I'm talking about are ands of knitting together pieces and saying this is also a piece of the Torah, even though it's separate, but it's not separate, which is different than saying, of land flowing with milk and honey. That the conjunction is natural. Here, the conjunction is seemingly unnecessary, but by insisting on making those kinds of conjunctions, the Torah is conjoining. The Torah is stitching together separate pieces of text.
So I have a question.
One second. Alter is not writing as a religious person. I don't presume to know what is in his heart, but he's not, he's not an obvious practicing traditional Jew in public. When he's in conferences, he's not wearing a yarmulke and stuff like that. But there's a certain kind of religious, secularized commitment that he has made to the text, where he's saying this text is extraordinary on its own merits, and I'm going to honor it and preserve it as best as I can in this other language that I'm blessed to know. So there's a kind of a reverence that he's exhibiting by doing this. Yeah, Sarita.
So just looking at, as you noted, at the beginning of this Parsha, Vayadaber, then again at the beginning of chapter 5, Vayadaber, and then we had Vayadaber again in verse 5. And I looked a little bit further, on page 796, Vayadaber. Is it ever just without the va? I mean,
it would be hard to find one. I don't know. Offhand, I can't think of any. I don't know. Right now, I can't think of any. Keep on the lookout for it.
Yeah, I mean, so that, I mean, if that's the case, how
delightful it will be when you find one.
Right, but then it's like, well, why?
Yeah,
then you'll be asking why in this case isn't there a va?
That's right. That'll be fodder for your thought and for coming up with something good. So great.
Can't we just say that in this situation, the vav is meant to change the tense, to change it from a future tense to a past tense, as it sometimes
Well, that
does.
begs the question. So don't put in the vav and don't make it a past tense. I mean, don't make it a future tense with a vav. Put it in past tense. Diber Hashem el Moshe lemor, or Hashem diber el Moshe lemor. Write it like that. Why do that? That's the thing. What Michael, though, is pointing out is that the vav is not only a conjunction, but it operates as a reversal of tense. The word yidaber means he will speak. Right. But the translation is always spoke, past tense. So the Hebrew conjugation, I think is what it is, or declension, what is it? Is future tense.
Verbs conjugated and nouns decline.
Nouns, and other people also decline. But so this is a conjugation of a verb in the future tense. And then the vav is called the vav hahipuch, or the vav hamahapechet. And that vav is not only an and, but also it signals that this is not to be read as future tense, but as past tense.
But at least with regard to translation, you could say that this vav doesn't mean and, it just reverses the tense.
Well, that's part of the discussion. That's part of the discussion. Does it still retain that conjunctive quality or not? I think that you would have to, you'd have to find some really, really interesting proof to say that it loses its conjunctive function altogether. You know, so what can I say? And I was gonna say something. Oh, we sometimes don't pay attention to this when we read Torah. We should. How do we know that this is a flipping vav and not just a conjunctive vav? Whether it's also conjunctive, forget it, but we know it's flipping. The answer is that the sound underneath it is va instead of v. V yedaber is, and he will speak.
So va is the reversing vav?
Va signals this is a reversing vav. If we don't pronounce that va, then correctly, if we say v, then we are missing the meaning. And the opposite. If something is a v, usually it's conjunctive. And pronouncing it as a va changes the meaning. So unfortunately, sometimes we have a prayer that some people have offered on behalf of the community, the blessing for the new month. And we say, God, may it be your will to please bless this new month. V'titen lanu chayim aruchim. And please give us long life. Future tense. And then some people say, Vatiten lanu chayim aruchim. That's wrong. That says you gave us long life. That's changing the future into the past. So you have to pay attention to what the pronunciation is. It changes the meaning. Okay, so enough of this already. Let's get into real meaning. Go ahead.
And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the Israelites. Should man or woman commit any of the human offenses to betray the trust of the Lord, that person shall bear guilt. And they shall confess their offenses which they committed, and he shall render back for his guilt the sum of its principal, and the fifth part of it he shall add to it, and give it to him whom he wronged. And if the man should have no redeemer to render back to him for his guilt, what is rendered back shall be the Lord's, the priest's. Besides the ram of atonement, with which he will atone for himself. And every donation for all the sacred offerings of the Israelites that they bring forward to the priest, his shall it be. And a man's sacred offerings shall be his. That which he gives to the priest shall be his. Keep going.
Okay, that says it all.
It sounds like your punishment is having to do math.
It's having to read these English locutions of everything. Okay, so let's get the setup. The setup says that, and here we already have a little bit of a subtle distinction in the translation. Verse 6, speak to the children of Israel, the Israelites, and say what?
Should man or woman commit any of the human offenses?
And our translation is when.
Yeah. Is Hebrew, if they just say men, does it imply men and women?
It says here a man or a woman in the Hebrew.
Oh, that's okay.
No, I was talking about when. So
Right.
the should is definitely conditional. The when could be interpreted as conditional, or that this is going to happen. that this is going to happen. And so be prepared because it is going to happen. And the should is maybe so hypothetical, but maybe it never will happen. So that, I mean, it's a different, yeah.
Right.
A little more faith in us with the should.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Let me tuck away this little tiny and fine print just in case.
Yeah.
Right? Yes. So either when or should, and then how does the rest of it go again, Jen?
Should man or woman commit any of the human offenses to be
true? Let's stop there.
Yeah.
And what do we have?
Any wrong toward a fellow man.
Okay. So the question in the Hebrew, it says Mikol chatot hadam.
That is unique here. It's a unique phrase.
So there's a little note at the bottom, right? Kol chatot adam. So chatat is a sin, a wrongdoing, right? Chatot, plural. Ha-adam, the human being. But now the question is, how do you relate those two words? The sins, the human being. Our translation is a sin toward a human being, right? But his translation is should a man
commit any of the human offenses.
Any of the human offenses. A little bit different, right? It's not an object against which we sin. It is the condition of our sinning. We're human. Right? We're human, so of course we're going to sin. Bringing back the should and the when into a little more complicated relationship, right? Human sins, we're guilty of human sins, aren't we? To call the sin human, who else sins? Angels don't sin. So animals don't sin. So, the idea of calling it a human sin is like a redundancy, right? In what sense is calling this human meaningful? Well, what are we talking about? So we get to the rest of it. What's the rest of the phrase? The rest of the sentence?
To betray the trust of the Lord, that person shall bear guilt.
Okay. So
that's different too.
And we have it also different. At what?
That person realizes his guilt.
Wait, before that.
Oh, breaking faith with the Lord.
Breaking faith with the Lord, as opposed to betraying what?
The trust of the Lord.
Betraying the trust of the Lord. This is a translation and an attempt to translate lim'ol ma'al. Right? So that's, and then it says Bashem, right? The eternal. The Ashma hanefesh ahi is the Hebrew. The translation in Alter is?
That person shall bear guilt.
And our translation is?
That person realizes his guilt.
Okay, very different, right? And let's go back to the betrayal part. So we have breaking faith, betrayal, that's pretty close, right? I think that there's a general sense. So let's think about that for a second. What does that mean? We're talking about breaking faith with God, betraying God's trust. What in the end actually is the sin that happened? What happened? You read it already in the English, but you can look. What actually happened?
Doesn't the term limol also mean somebody who misappropriates holy property?
Right, a violation of the holy. It's a violation. It's an incursion, either an appropriation to take something from the holy for yourself, or to break through into the holy when you shouldn't, when you didn't respect that it's supposed to be holy. So what exactly was the act that this person did? So if we look back at the beginning of Vayikra, look at 604 is in our Eitz Chaim. This is Leviticus chapter 5, verse 20.
Altars goes the wrong way. I always get confused. It's like an English book. And should a person offend when he...
Let's go, verse 20, come on.
Oh, 20. Oh, I'm sorry. Chapter 5. My bad.
Vayedaber.
There it is.
Yep. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, should a person offend and betray the Lord's trust, and dissemble with his fellow about a deposit or pledge, or by theft, or defraud his fellow, or should he find something lost and dissemble about it, and swear falsely about anything of what a person may do to offend, and it shall be, when he offends and is guilty, he shall return the theft that he stole, or the fraud that he committed, or the deposit that was placed with him, or the lost thing that he found, or anything he swore about falsely, and he shall pay back the principal, and at a fifth, to him to whom it belongs he shall give it, when his guilt is confirmed. Okay. And his guilt, that goes on to the unblemished ram. And his guilt offering he shall bring to the Lord an unblemished ram from the flock, or its equivalent, as a guilt offering to the priest. And the priest shall atone for him before the Lord, and it shall be forgiven him for whatever he may have done to incur guilt thereby.
Okay, so in short, what's happened is that a person has been dishonest in some way, a sin of omission mostly, right? Where I have information that can help somebody and I refuse to pass it along, or I know where something is and I don't tell the person who's looking for it. Mostly that's the kind of stuff that we're talking about. How is this characterized by the Torah? What's the overall description that the Torah gives to such a set of sins?
Betraying the Lord's trust.
Right, trespass against the Lord.
Trust, right? These are all interpersonal sins. This is all about being dishonest to our fellow. This is about me cheating another human being. And yet the Torah calls it right up front, before it gets into the details, this is a betrayal of God's trust. And Michael's point is usually or many times, we have it in other places, this is about violating the holy. If there's something that, for instance, belongs to the temple, and I take it and use it for my own personal use, that's called me'ilah. That's violating the capital T, trust, the holy trust, like bankers' trust. So, I'm taking property that doesn't belong to me and I'm misusing it. In that sense, there's a betrayal of the holy. So here, you just have to take it to heart. The Torah's choice of characterizing these kinds of sins, which are completely between two people, the way that the Torah puts it is, this is a betrayal of God. You're betraying God's expectation of you, right? The Hebrew is even actually a little bit stronger. Lim'ol ma'al bashem. It's like when we think about misappropriation of funds. Here's a golden bowl that belongs to the temple. I take it from the temple and I use it for myself. So I've sinned against the contents of the temple. Here I'm sinning against, in a certain sense, the contents of God. Right? I am mo'eling. I am creating a betrayal in God, Hashem. This is like stabbing God in the heart. So what's this all about? How do we unpack this a little bit?
Well, it's interesting that it's not focusing on the human-to-human interaction.
The human interaction, the responsibility that I have to my fellow is absolute.
Not only render it back, etc.
I have to pay it back, and not only that, I get fined.
Right.
So I have to pay that person another 20%. Oh, there's a punishment here. This is bad punishment. But, and then I have to go to God and make good with God. We've talked about this many, many times, the Yom Kippur message, right? That you can't go be quits with God if it's a sin that you've committed against your fellow human being. But we sort of say, when we talk about that in Yom Kippur, we talk about two different categories. There's a sin, bein adam lachaveiro. There's a sin of bein adam lamakom, a sin between one person and their fellow. And there's a different kind of sin between one person and God. So we keep them as two different, compartments. Here, the Torah is simply saying, you do this to another human being. This is a betrayal of God. Right? As if you took the menorah out of the temple and used it for a chandelier for yourself.
Rabbi, isn't every nevera that someone commits a trespass against Hashem?
Yes, absolutely. You're right. And that's
by definition.
Yes, by definition, God tells us to treat each other right. So every time we're not doing that to another person, we're sinning against God. So why would we call it though? So that's a sin. We violate the law. Here, it's a little bit. It's characterization. What I was trying to say before, its characterization has a little bit more of an emotional quality to it. Right? Betrayal, is not the same thing as an avera. Right?
Rabbi, in my translation, it says to commit a trespass against the Lord.
Okay. I would say that that's an inadequate translation. Trespass is a good translation for avera. And avera literally means passing over the line that you shouldn't pass. Me'ila is a much more heavy word, right? It's more serious in its upsetness about doing this. It really is about betraying a trust. Like when in the in the text on the Sota, she betrays her husband's trust by hanging out with another guy. So it's that kind of, it's about a relationship that is being, disrespected, disregarded, destroyed, wounded. So, but your question is good. So isn't every sin that way? So I would say the answer is no. Here we have sins that are much more subtle. As I said, they're sins of omission. Who is going to know whether you really knew the information that you didn't give to help this person?
Hashem.
Only Hashem. Exactly. You could go through the rest of your days and just simply keep your mouth shut. That wallet that you know where it was lost, you forget about it. I'm going to keep my nose clean. I'm going to mind my own business. I'm not going to get involved, right? During the pandemic, if you watch detective shows, right? How many people don't want to tell the detective, the things that they know? Sometimes because they're real mean, they're one of the bad guys. Sometimes because they're scared, or because they really just want to keep themselves out of these things, right? So this now is where God is saying, that's not what I expect of you. To turn your back on another human being and think you can get away with it. You could, but you're not going to get away with it from me. My sense of wrong is acute. This is something that you have done to me. And that brings us to the next part of the differences in the translation. How much, when this person fesses up, what's coming up? What's happening to this person when they fess up? Right? It's not like all of a sudden new pieces of evidence come about to prove that he sinned. It doesn't quite say that. So Alter says, the end of verse 6, that
to betray the trust of the Lord, that person shall bear guilt.
That person shall bear guilt. So I'm carrying around this guilt until such time as, next verse, I confess. According to the translation that we have in JPS, what's the translation?
That person realizes his guilt.
So that comes more at like sort of another moment or something where you're thinking about this. I realized that what I did was wrong. I don't want to keep doing this wrong thing. I don't want to persist in my silence. I'm going to step forward. So, either one of those two translations fits into the picture, slightly different way, but that's what we have here. We have here a story, a narrative within the law that depends on a person's change of heart. It depends on the person coming to grips with their own conscience or even waking up their conscience. And it could go on for a long time, right? You could not think about this for God knows how long and just excuse it. People make wonderful excuses for themselves all the time. We're very good at it, all of us. And then something hits you and you realize, I can't do this. I can't keep on doing this. And then we hit Vadu. Verse 7, go ahead.
And they shall confess their offenses which they committed, and he shall render back for his guilt the sum of its principal, and a fifth part of it he shall add to it, and give it to him whom he wronged.
Okay, so this is basically a repetition of what we had in Leviticus. Okay, and we only have a couple more minutes, so we're going to just sort of accept that, okay? But now we have a new thing. We have a new provision in verse 8.
And if the man should have no redeemer to render back to him for his guilt.
So this is what we don't have, I don't think, in Vayikra. What if you can't make restitution? What if you can't find the person? What if the person is dead? What if the person, flew to the moon or something?
You pay it forward to Hashem.
So then who do you give it to? So then now that betrayal of God's trust takes on a slightly new meaning. Right? If you're gonna make the restitution to the person you have wronged, then God is the second person that you have wronged, and you're gonna make restitution to God. I want to come back to our initial sort of trivial point. Do the ands make sense here? I would contend that the ands here are, in some measure, much more justifiable than at the beginning of the paragraph.
Yeah.
Because this is taking us through the process, the steps of the various pieces of the story. Right? So he's needs to do this, and if there isn't, there's this. So I think that the challenge to the ands here is not, it is a little bit weaker. Okay, how do you give it to God? You throw it up into heaven and it stays up there?
No, it goes through the temple.
It goes to the priest, doesn't it?
Yes, the priest takes it. It goes to the priest. The priests become in loco deus or something.
Parentis.
Who, what?
Parentis. Local parentis.
Right, that's the phrase, but I was trying to make it like in loco parentis divinis, right? The divine parent, right? So they are in the place of God, and they, exercise that function again and again and again. Every time they eat from some of the sacrifices, they are God's mouth and God's teeth and God's alimentary canal. They are eating the sacrifice as God would be eating the sacrifice. Yeah.
I never thought I would say this, but it seems to me that what we're saying here is almost like what happened in Catholicism before Protestant, Martin Luther, that we were selling these dispensations.
We're not selling a dispensation here. We're making.
That's what we're doing. We're giving it to the priests.
But that's only as a last resort. If you can't find the person that you're supposed to pay,
why not just give it to a poor person?
That's not restitution. That's tzedakah. Tzedakah is something else that you're obligated to do. This is about taking away your wrongdoing. Right? So, but another part of the answer to you is, where do you think the church got it from? So, okay.
Well, that seems clear.
We're going to have to stop now. So, Yashikot, everyone. Next week, I'm going to be away. So, there's no session next week. All right. Be well, everybody.
Be well.
Thank
Bye-bye,
you.
sir.